All right. How you doing, everybody? This is a presentation called Modular CSS. I'm going to walk you through the philosophy behind how we organize and structure our CSS here at Say Media. If you like what I have to say in this presentation, you might also enjoy my newsletter, Friday Front End. We tweet out links daily and email a summary at the end of the week. So I talk about this kind of stuff all the time. This is kind of a natural outgrowth of that. So let's get started. The primary problem that Modular CSS was created to solve is that CSS at scale is really tricky. I love this quote from Nicholas Gallagher. It says, when somebody gives you a problem, instead of saying, can you build this, you should think about, can you maintain this after you build it? That kind of gets to the heart of the problem with CSS at scale is it's not that it's difficult to solve the problems, it's that it's difficult to solve the problems in a way that isn't going to cripple you with technical debt over time. Here's a good example of the kind of problem that we run into. Nobody but the person who wrote this knows what this code does. How are box and profile related? How are profile and avatar related? Are they related at all? Should you be using the pro user class alongside the bio class? Will image and profile live in the same part of the CSS? Can you use avatar anywhere else or only here? Like there's no way to answer that question here. You have to go do a bunch of detective work in the CSS. Another problem is that CSS at scale is difficult to reuse. You've got a style that's on one page that you want to reuse on another page, but when you go put the same class there, you find out that it was written in a way that only works on the first page. It assumed that it was living inside of a certain div, or it assumed that it was inheriting certain classes from that page, and it just doesn't work at all. You don't want to break the original, so you duplicate the code, but now you've got two problems. You've got your original code and your duplicated code, you're violating best practices, and you've doubled your maintenance burden. Another problem is that CSS at scale is difficult to maintain. You change the markup and the entire thing just falls down like a house of cards. You want to change a style on one page, and you finally got it set up so this one class works on two pages, but it ends up breaking another page without you intending to. You try to override the other page, but now you're caught in a specificity war. And again, this reminds me of one of my absolute favorite CSS jokes. Two CSS properties walk into a bar, and a table in a bar across town collapses. So how do we solve this? The concept of modularity comes to our rescue here, but what does that even mean? My personal hero, Harry Roberts, CSS Wizardry. If you learn nothing else from this talk, go follow this man. He is brilliant. He thinks about this stuff at a very high level. It says, code that adheres to the separation of concerns is more easily modified, edited, extended, and maintained because we know how far its responsibilities reach. We know that modifying layout will only ever modify layout and nothing else. So he talks about this a lot. This is a common programming practice that a lot of CSS developers aren't familiar with, but this idea of separation of concern, of namespacing, of scope, of making sure that the thing you're writing isn't going to do more than it was actually written to do. Let me give you an example. The way that I used to work, I would get a comp like this from my designer. And I'd go, okay, I'm looking at a bookstore page. I've got a few modules in a sidebar here. I've got, a list of what I assume are, book covers over on the right side. I've got a featured book review. I've got a couple more book reviews down here. I'm probably going to start by putting an ID at the top of the page that lets me scope my styles to this page because, I'm a smart developer and I don't want the stuff I write here to break, say, the account management page. So I'm going to do that. Modular CSS asks you to step back and instead of thinking about this at the page level, look at the fact that your page is made up of small chunks of discrete content. This isn't a page, this is a collection of pieces. You've got your logo, you've got your search bar, you've got your navigation, you've got your photo list, you've got your secondary nav, You've got a tabbed box over here, a video player, etc. These are discrete pieces of content that could be used anywhere in your site. They just happen to be assembled this way on this particular page. Does this remind you of anything? It should. The Lego analogy is used by almost everyone who writes about modular CSS for a good reason. The idea of building a UI out of standardized, easy-to-understand blocks that behave predictably regardless of context is a great concept. One of the earliest and most famous examples of this is the media object. This was created by Nicole Sullivan. We'll talk about her a little bit more later. But she argued that this is one of the smallest, most discrete blocks of content pattern that you're going to find on any site. This idea of a fixed width image paired with flexible width content. You see this absolutely everywhere. And she had a case study that I've linked here at the bottom called The Media Object Saves Hundreds of Lines of Code, talking about applying this pattern to large-scale sites. One of her biggest examples of it was Facebook. So every pink box you see here is an example of the media object. Fixed width image, flexible width text. And you can see that even though they're used for different purposes, they're all the same module. They're all the same underlying concept. You've got the My Profile up in the upper left. You've got each post in the feed. You've got navigation elements up at the right side. Even the ads use the media object. And you can see that in some cases they're nested within each other. You've got the Dave Raggett catch up on Facebook, and nested within that is another media object for send him a message. But her point was, again, we're talking about operating at scale. On Facebook, there's not 10 or 20 or 30. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of media objects on pages like this. You can imagine that if you were able to optimize the code for this repeatable bit of content, it would have very real performance and cost savings. So let's talk about object-oriented CSS. OOCSS was created by Nicole Sullivan in 2009. It's based on her work at Yahoo, again, operating at scale, very large search engine mail program. And it's basically the origin point of modular CSS. Her key concept when she wrote object-oriented was that objects are reusable patterns whose visual appearance is not determined by their context. She has this great quote that a CSS object repeating visual pattern that can be abstracted into an independent bit of HTML CSS and that can be reused throughout the site. So this is the roots of modular CSS. This is the very core principle that she's defined way back in 2009. She had a few core principles about OOCSS. First of all, that an object should look the same no matter where you put it. Rather than style all the buttons in the sidebar orange and the buttons in the main area blue, you should make a button style that's blue and then make a button modifier that's orange. So these orange buttons can be used anywhere. They're not contextual to the sidebar. That's just one of your button styles. So yeah, another way to put it, it's not styled based on its context. Another concept that she talked about, abstract the structure of an object from the skin that's being applied. So again, that example of the media object or the button, the way that it looks is independent from the markup and the structure that's defined. So in the case of a media object, there's a containing div, there's the fixed width image, and then there's the content. Now you can style that 100 different ways, but that markup, that structure is going to be the same regardless of how it looks. And another thing she advised was creating reusable classes for common visual patterns. So one of her examples was if you went to Amazon back in 2009, there were drop shadows on almost everything, right? There were tabs everywhere, but all the drop shadows were just a little bit different. They were all graphical elements. They had all been made by different artists, and they were similar, but they weren't the same. And her argument, again, is by standardizing, we can optimize and make the site more performant. And finally, she had a principle that was very controversial at the time, but has since borne out. And that is the idea that you should use classes to name your objects, as opposed to using IDs and targeting elements nested inside of them. If you're like me and you kind of came up in the Zeldman and Eric Meyer era of web standards, this is almost heretical. This is really controversial when she said this. The idea that you should put a class on everything. But what she was really getting at is you don't want your markup to determine your CSS. So if I change the headline from an H1 to an H4, I should not have to go update my CSS. That headline should have a class on it, and that class is going to be applied regardless of what markup element is there. So for example, instead of header UL, which is tied to two different markup elements, you put a class on the UL called site nav. Later, your UL might move to a different element. It might change from UL to an OL, but it won't matter because the class is going to stay the same. And finally, you might actually remember this one, even if you weren't paying attention to CSS back at the time. She was the one that started the whole idea of not using IDs at all. She was very hardline about this. She put out a CSS linter that basically threw up an error on every single site you ran it on because everyone was using IDs. But her point was IDs mess up specificity because they're too strong. But more to the point, components are meant to be reusable, and IDs, by definition, are unique. So if you put an ID on your component, you're already missing the point of a reusable object. So kind of the next big framework ecosystem that came out in the modular ecosystem was BEM, which stands for Block Element Modifier. BEM was created in 2009 by a Russian internet company that I'd never heard of until I started this research, called Yandex. But Yandex is essentially Yahoo/Google/Facebook. They are the largest tech company in Russia. They operate a search engine. They operate a webmail program. They are solving the exact same problems that Yahoo was in 2009. And at the same time, parallel development, they came up with a very similar set of operating principles for how to write code. And their key concept was that what Nicole called objects, they called blocks. But blocks are made up of smaller elements, and they can be modified, or as Nicole called it, skinned. This is Varya Stepanova. She was one of the lead front-enders working on BEM back in the day. And she says, BEM is a way to modularize the development of your pages. By breaking your interface into components, you can have your interface divided into independent parts, each with its own development cycle. I love this because I had never thought about it that way, but this makes perfect sense. If you're having to pitch to your project managers, to your business directors, that you want to change the way you're writing CSS at scale, this is a great way to pitch it. Like, hey, you know how currently I can't work on more than one thing at once? Now we can, because theoretically, all of our modules are independent. So I could work on this one, Joe could work on that one, Bob could work on that one. None of us would ever affect each other because we're all working in these tightly contained modules. So BEM is made up of three parts: blocks, elements, and modifiers. Blocks, like I said, are functionally equivalent to what Nicole called objects. They are logically and functionally independent components of a web page. They added a few additional definitions. First of all, they said blocks are nestable. They should be capable of being nested inside of each other. A good example of that is you might have a module that's a tabbed interface widget in your sidebar. That module might contain buttons, which are another module. The styles for your buttons and the styles for the tabbed element don't interact with each other. It just happens that the button element is nested inside the other one. And finally, blocks should be repeatable. An interface should be able to contain multiple instances. same as Nicole said, the idea here is to get at reuse. So elements are a constituent part of a block that cannot be used outside of it. A good example is if you have navigation, if you have a menu, the navigation items, the menu items inside of it, don't make sense outside the larger context of the menu. You wouldn't have a module for a menu item. You would have a module for a menu, and the menu item is a child element of a module. And lastly, they have modifiers, which are, again, functionally equivalent to what Nicole called skinning. A modifier defines the appearance and behavior of a block or an element. For example, the appearance of a menu block might change depending on the modifier that's used on it. This is probably getting a little abstract, so let me step back and give you an analogy. This is your standard Lego minifig, nice blue spaceman. Your minifig is your block module, right? This is your module, this is your component, this is your object, whatever you want to call it. This is your core element. But minifig is made up of smaller pieces. It's made up of a head, it's made up of headgear, a backpack, torso, and legs. So this is your block and your elements. And then you can also get different colored minifigs, right? Well, those are your modifiers. You have minifig red, minifig yellow, minifig Batman, so on and so forth. The other thing that BEM did that made them very popular and arguably the most common modular CSS framework in use today is they have a very strict naming convention. This looks a little complicated up front, so let me break it down for you. First of all, the names for all of your BEM parts are written in lowercase. Words within names are separated by hyphens, so block-name. That's always going to be one element. You can tell by the hyphens. Elements, so the child pieces of your block, are delimited by double underscores. So block-name, underscore, underscore, element-name. And lastly, modifiers, similarly, are delimited by double hyphens. So block-name, dash, dash, module, modifier-name. So here's an example of BEM in practice. You've got your button block, you've got child elements, you've got button price and button text, and then you've got two modifiers on the block, big and orange. Now, those double dashes and double underscores might look a little off-putting if you're not used to using them, but again, the idea here is you should be able to look at this and tell at a glance what is going on. By following this naming convention, you can tell by reading code what is happening without having to go do that detective work. That is a huge step forward. Whether you like their naming convention or not, this idea of applying a strict naming convention to tell what you're looking at is a huge step forward. So as with object-oriented, BEM added a couple of principles they apply. First of all, they argue that you should not nest CSS. Nested selectors increase specificity, they make code reuse more difficult, and they're really only appropriate for styling elements based on the state of a block or its modifier. This principle works because we put a strongly defined name on every element of a BEM object. So the module itself has a unique name, and every child element of the module has a unique name. And as a result, none of your classes need to be nested because they're named appropriately. So even though everything is a single class at the root level of your CSS, just by reading down, you can tell what everything is. As a rule, if a selector will work without being nested, then don't nest it. BEM naming provides the namespace, so we don't have to do that anymore. It used to be we had to nest a lot of things just to isolate it within context, but with BEM naming, you don't need that. So last of all, we're going to talk briefly about SMACSS. SMACSS stands for Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS. Those of you here at SAE probably recognize it because this is probably the closest to the pattern that we use, although we kind of take pieces from everywhere BEM was created by Jonathan Snook in 2011. Weirdly, he also worked at Yahoo. I don't know what it is. If you guys remember, in the mid-2000s, Yahoo had a killer front-end team, and a lot of really smart people came out of there. It's kind of funny now to think about it, since Yahoo is such a non-entity. But yeah, so Jonathan was writing CSS at scale, specifically on Yahoo Mail. And the key concept that he added, kind of building on Nicole's work before him, was that different categories of objects need to be handled differently. He says, at the very core of SMACSS is categorization, because by categorizing our rules, we can see patterns, and we can define better practices around those patterns. So the categories that he defined are, first of all, base rules are default styles for things like links, paragraphs, and headlines. We're talking about raw HTML elements. You don't even put classes on these. These are the native elements that you need to control the appearance of. Secondly, layout rules. Layout rules are used only for layout. They will not define colors. They will not define typography. They're only used to control how elements are arranged on the page. And they typically hold one or more modules inside them. Next, we have modules. Same concept as BEM blocks and Nicole's objects. These are the reusable modular parts of the design, like callouts, sidebar sections, etc. And then he added the concept of state rules. So state rules are special states that a module can be applied to. So for example, hidden, expanded, active. These are typically things that you're going to apply with JavaScript, but not always. But he recognized this was different than a block. This was different than a modifier. This was kind of a special state that it could exist in that might be applied or taken away at different times. He also had a fifth one called theme, but I'm not going to waste your time talking about that because it really only applies to Yahoo Mail, where you might apply like a user theme to how your mail client appears, but nobody else really does that. So the next principle he introduced that we've found really useful is the idea of using prefixes to differentiate between different types of rules. So, he liked the idea that BEM had a clear naming convention, but since he had added these categories, he wanted to be able to tell at a glance what type of module he was looking at. So he prefixes his rules with L for layout, M for modules, and is for state rules. And you'll see this in our code here at Say. We've got M in front of almost everything, and we've got L in front of all of our layout rules. You'll see a little bit less of, but we use that as well. Sometimes people advocate for prefixing JavaScript-specific rules with JS so that you can tell at a glance, don't touch this, it's something that JavaScript is adding or removing. But again, that core concept is, by adding prefixes to our naming convention, we communicate that much more clearly in our code. So let's talk about how they all work together, because the point that I've been trying to make here is that object-oriented, BEM, SMACSS, these are all just isolated ways of thinking that all contribute to a larger concept. They all kind of rest on this larger concept of modular CSS. So what do they have in common? These methodologies, they're a lot more alike than they are different. Their evolution, and maybe I'm reading into it, but I see a very clear path from object-oriented to BEM to SMACSS. I think it represents our industry's growing experience with operating at scale, right? Like when Nicole was working in 2009, not very many people were operating at scale. When Jonathan added his rules in 2011, more people were. And we're continuing to make changes here at Say, and other people that I talk to in the industry are also doing that. More and more people are getting used to this idea of needing to be performant. So we're learning as an industry and growing this underlying philosophy. But we don't have to limit ourselves to one. It's not like you have to pick BEM or pick SMACSS. These aren't conflicting philosophies. We can look at what they share and keep the best parts. So here's what I see as the commonalities between them. Modular elements of a modular CSS system include the module, the reusable pattern itself, the child element, just like in BEM, and the module modifier. And just like from SMACSS, this concept of categorizing our modules is very valuable. Base rules for HTML elements, the layout rules to control how modules are arranged on the page, module rules to put visual styles on your reusable components, state rules for things that are added by JavaScript. And we've added another one. This is something we learned from Harry Roberts' CSS Wizardry. Helper rules, which are small, scoped rules that are unconnected to a module. For example, H-uppercase. That is a predictable class. I know what's going to happen when I put that on any given module. It's going to make the text uppercase. And of the rules that these frameworks give us, I think there are some that are very valuable. We definitely do not use IDs. That's a principle I agree with. We don't nest CSS deeper than one level. You do need to nest one level deep for modifiers and state rules, but you never need to go deeper than that. We add classes to all of our child elements, so we're not tied to particular markup. And we prefix our class names so that our code becomes more self-documenting. So, I'll be honest with you, I only started learning how to do this stuff properly about a year and a half ago when I started here at SAE. I've been learning a lot from my coworkers Smith and Goggin. I sit next to Goggin, and he's kind of always coming over and slapping me on the wrist, like, nope, don't do that. That's not right. And I'm always like, why? Why can't we do this? So this facts section, these are a lot of the frustrations that I experienced when I first started trying to do this. The first objection that I had was, oh my god, there's so many classes. You'd go look at your HTML, and there's like sometimes dozens of classes on an element. This is insanity. But I've done a bunch of research on this. It might look ugly, but it does not hurt your performance. They've done studies that have shown that your code compresses up really nicely. The classes that are on your HTML elements are not the performance bottleneck. And it helps self-document your code. Carefully scoped classes also help others combine your Lego blocks in new ways. So for example, the other day, Vicky was setting something up in the CMS and took some of the classes that I had created and put them together in a way I hadn't anticipated, but it worked because I had followed the principles of making these classes as small and tight as possible. So even though I hadn't expected them to work together, they were discrete enough that they didn't conflict. And don't be afraid of long class names. Like some of these BEM names that we see they get pretty lengthy, but that's a feature. That's not a bug. They are self-documenting. A lot of people, when I look online, advocate doing something like defining all the classes as normal, but instead of putting, 2, 3, 6, 12, 24 classes on an element, they say create a new class in your file that uses a preprocessor to inject all those smaller classes inside it. So you extend all the smaller classes or include them. CSS Wizardry wrote about this, and I liked his take on it. Basically, he favors the multi-class approach over something like extend because using multiple classes in your markup, first of all, gives you a better paper trail. It lets you quickly and explicitly see which classes are acting on a piece of HTML. And finally, it allows for greater composition in classes that are not tightly bound to other styles in your CSS. When you're building a UI component, you should try to see if you can break it into two parts, one for structural styles and another for visual styles. So at the very least, if you follow this principle, you'll find yourself consciously thinking of, even though in the end I want all of these rules applied to this element, that doesn't mean they need to be grouped together in my style sheet that way. So at the very least, break out layout and style, and you'll find yourself starting to think along the lines of more modular classes. Another one, this is a pretty common reaction. You learn about BEM and you go, okay, great, I get it. There's modules and there's child elements. That makes sense. What if I have a grandchild element, right? I've got minifig, my minifig has an arm, and my minifig's arm has a hand. What's the naming convention for that? And the answer is there's no such thing as a grandchild class. Minifig hand is what you would actually write. Because you don't want your CSS to be tied to the structure of the DOM. Right now, hand is a child of arm, but it might not be tomorrow. And this is where this analogy starts to break down, because now you're all picturing some sort of horrible mutant Lego man with a hand coming right out of his shoulder. But the larger point remains, right? Your DOM structure should not be driving your CSS structure. This is one that Gagan and I struggle with a lot. When you end up with a conflict between modules, how do you resolve it? If I've got two modules and one of them is trying to make the text bold and one of them is trying to make the text not bold, how do you determine which one wins? And unfortunately, the answer is your modules shouldn't overlap in a perfect world. One rule that I've seen online to help enforce this is there's a grunt plugin you can get that will take all of your SASS partials and load them in a random order, which I'm not seeing a lot of reaction in here, but trust me, it's a terrifying concept. The idea of just randomly breaking the cascade. But it ties into this idea of your modules should be discrete. They should be independent enough that it kind of doesn't matter what order they come in, because they don't touch the same thing. A good example of this is if you start finding yourself in a situation where you're like, okay, I've got my button module, and if my button module appears inside this other module, I want it to be red. Stop and step back. What you're really describing is a new modifier for button. Yes, you want the button to be red when it's inside this other module, but what you really want is this button happens to be red inside of this module. It could also be red somewhere else. So make that a modifier on the button module, and don't worry about the fact that it happens to be nested inside this other module. That said, this is difficult. We do run into problems every now and then. If you really run into problems, consider using a helper class. The example I gave you of trying to make text bold or not bold, or a better example from the helper I mentioned earlier, uppercase text. Harry Roberts recommends that you add bang important to all of your helper classes. And his take on this is, we all used to be taught that bang important was no, you should never use bang important. But he argues that using bang important is fine as long as you're using it proactively and not reactively. If you're using bang important to fix a problem that you've created, that's not good. If you're using bang important to ensure that this particular helper class will always win, that makes sense. I can't imagine a scenario where I put the class H uppercase on something and I would expect to see it render anything other than uppercase. That's a good example of where to use bang important. Actually, after I gave this talk the first time, I saw this tweet, and I love it, so I injected it in here so you guys get the benefit of me giving this talk a second time. Your daily reminder that components are not about reuse, they're about isolation. Reuse is just a useful emergent property of isolation. This is a great principle to really get drummed into your head. The core idea when you're writing your modules is that they are self-contained, independent, discrete chunks of code. That happens to make them reusable. But if you don't happen to reuse a particular module on your site, that's not a failure of modular design. It just means that you haven't found a second place where you need to use it yet. It's still a good idea to isolate your stuff. Another challenge we've run into is we're trying to use Flexbox a lot lately, and we're trying to make our layout classes, and it's pretty difficult to make Flexbox layout modules that don't end up looking an awful lot like one module modifier for every single Flexbox option. It's really easy to get into the trap of writing like L-flex, align center. Like that's not how you want to go down this road, because you're going to end up with dozens of modifiers and 5 to 6 classes on every element that you're laying out with Flexbox. Instead, step back and try to remember that the larger concept of modular design is that you're looking for patterns. So don't get proactive and start creating layout modules for every possible combination of Flexbox. Look at the patterns that you're actually using. And what I suspect you'll find is there will be 3 layout patterns that you're actually using. You've got the one where everything's kind of evenly spaced. You've got the one where everything wraps onto the next line, and you've got the one where it's vertical. So go make those as layout modules that aren't really tied to Flexbox, because in 2 years, when grid is stable, we're all going to want to use that anyway. So don't get tied to particular CSS. Look for your visual patterns. I've got the shruggy on here because we're still solving this problem. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. You may have noticed that I haven't really mentioned preprocessors other than a couple of throwaway mentions. That is because modular CSS is a philosophy that is independent of what preprocessor you choose, and as a result, it works with any or none of them. If you want to write raw CSS with no preprocessor, modular is still helpful. If you want to use SASS, if you want to use less, it really doesn't matter. Modular is going to work for you no matter what. And lastly, when I gave this presentation the first time, someone raised their hand and said, you mentioned object-oriented, you mentioned BEM, you mentioned SMACSS, but you didn't mention Bootstrap. The reason for that is Bootstrap is not a methodology, it is a pattern library, which is funny because they present themselves as a framework, but it's not really. It is a collection of discrete, reusable chunks of CSS and JavaScript that will apply visual patterns to your page. So the interesting thing is, Bootstrap is not a methodology, but it is built in a modular way. It is actually a pretty good example of modular design, if not naming convention. If you've used Bootstrap buttons, you're familiar with the idea of you have button, and then you have to add another class to define what color the button is. And then if you want the button to be small or large, you add another class that makes it small or large. That's very modular. Those are very discrete styles. They're self-documenting. When you look at them, you know what's happening. So, to recap, remember this? How are box and profile related? How are profile and avatar related? Are they related? Should you use pro image? Image and profile live together. Can you use avatar anywhere else? Nobody knows who wrote this. Oh my God, I'm going crazy. If we switch to BEM naming convention, but really, again, like I said, it doesn't matter whether you use BEM, it just matters that you use a naming convention. Suddenly, you can clearly see which classes are and are not related to each other and how. We know what classes we cannot use outside the scope of this component, and we know which classes we're free to reuse elsewhere. So you can see box is independent of profile. They would be named, they would both be named profile otherwise. You can see that pro user is actually a modifier of profile, and you can see that image is a child of profile, as is bio, but avatar is an independent class. Now, I don't know what these do. I would have to go look at the CSS, but I can make a guess, right? Profile is our actual module here. Box and avatar are separate classes that affect the way it looks. So maybe profile image just puts the image on there with the right size, and avatar makes it circular. I don't know, but the point is, at a glance at this code, it's self-documenting. I know what parts are related, and I have a good idea of where to go look in my CSS files to find out what they do. So the benefits of using modular. First of all, it simplifies your code and it facilitates refactoring. It leads to self-documenting code. As we just saw, when you've properly used modular, it should be very clear what a given class does. It leads to reusable code that doesn't influence anything outside of its own scope. And finally, perhaps most importantly, it naturally leads you down the road towards a pattern library. The whole point of using modular CSS is to identify the repeating patterns on your site. Once you've done that, you can put together a pattern library, which you can then take back and share with your designers and go, hey, here's all the stuff you guys have already designed. For example, did you know that we had 17 different kinds of buttons? I bet you didn't know that. Let's not make any more buttons. Let's focus on using these, or maybe change some of these to more useful ones. It also helps you identify duplicates. Once we started defining our pattern library, we discovered that, again, in our buttons, we had 3 different buttons that were nearly identical. They weren't quite the same, and we were able to work with designers to reduce scope and turn those into the same button. And these examples are minor. They're small, but they add up. When you start doing this across your entire code base, you slim down your code base, you identify repetitions, you make everything more efficient and more reusable, and that will make your site more performant. So to put it another way, modular makes your code predictable, maintainable, and performant. And if you remember this joke from earlier, I think we have to revisit the punchline. It doesn't really apply anymore. That's not going to happen. So instead, 2 CSS properties walk into a bar, and everything is fine, thanks to modular code and namespacing. It's not as funny, but this is the world I would rather live in. Thank you.